Hello everybody and welcome to the latest edition of Slice TV. And with me today is Tanya Finnie from RedHead Communications. So getting straight into it, Tanya, tell me about RedHead Communications. What's its background, or what is your background? Is it just because you got red hair, or is there more to it?
Certainly part of it. I grew up in Africa and lots of different countries, and I guess part of growing up being a little bit different, only 1% of the population, you used to feeling part of the out group and not really the in group, which is probably what sort of led to a company where I can speak to other people to make their world a better place around inclusivity and diversity as well. But I work as a global strategist, a cultural strategist, and I work with medium to larger organizations, and I help them fix their internal culture. You know, those silos in companies where the marketing department doesn't quite understand the advertising, the finance department, for example, even though they all speak English. Or ethnic cultures as well. There's lots of different cultural differences, social values, unconscious biases in the workplace. And I work with middle managers to top management to fix that within their organisations.
Well, how did you come about this then? I imagine you didn't sort of wake up one day and think, this is what I want to do. Where would this path go through?
It was a bit of a journey. I think in retrospect, probably was always destined to do this. But I grew up in lots of different countries. I was born in South Africa, but went to school for 6 years in Namibia. And spent some time then in Germany and Morocco and Kenya. And my career started off as a tour guide, taking people around and telling them about the different cultures. And in between, I gave up my apartment because I was on the road all the time and decided in my free time I will go and live with a Maasai warrior to learn about his culture in Kenya. I stayed with a Zulu chief and his 5 wives at some stage. I spent some time in Swaziland attending a Swazi wedding, which lasts for 7 days, and you hang a cow off a tree, which has to be killed by the groom, and it's quite different from the normal weddings that I used to attend. And this led me into a HR direction, and I then went back to organisations, consulting back to them and saying, why does one guy need 2 hours for a funeral and another guy need 2 weeks for a funeral, and how can we manage this fairly in the workplace? Okay,
so now in Perth, WA, what brought you to Perth then?
What brought me to Perth? I came here about, probably 14 years ago now. It was a variety of different reasons, but at the time things in South Africa was politically fairly unstable, and we decided to come and make our life here in WA. And there's parts of me that my heart will always be in Africa or a part of it, but I call WA very proudly home now. I always struggle when people ask me where exactly it is that I'm from, because I think I'm a global citizen. But I do certainly love Perth and love being here and love working with a marketeer, and it's so close to Asia, and it's a completely different market, of course, than in Africa.
So was it in Perth that you set up RedHead Communications as this new business, or is this business that you currently have?
Yes, so I started RedHead Communications a couple of years ago after a career as a manager of development and learning in a large training organisation. And I did a cultural course in Michigan with a guy called Dr. David Livermore, and he qualifies people to measure cultural intelligence. And I then became an advanced cultural intelligence facilitator, which means I can measure your cultural intelligence, basically.
Okay, all right. That sounds interesting. How do you go about measuring someone's cultural intelligence?
Well, there's a test that you can do, as you may be familiar with, or I'm sure everybody knows about our IQ, and it's normally a fairly set number that we measure as a child, and then emotional intelligence came about, and emotional intelligence is ultimately how we respond to other people's emotions appropriately. But emotional intelligence is also culturally bound. You may know how to respond appropriately to me because we're from a similar culture, But if I was from a completely different culture, maybe from Japan or from China, I may respond completely differently. And this is where cultural intelligence comes in. So cultural intelligence is measuring all of that diversity and how well you get on with that diversity, which could be ethnic diversity, but it can also be gender or generational, because there's all these little subcultures in each of those. And there's a test that you can do. It's an online test that takes about 20 minutes. And it spits out a whole bunch of data, produce about a 24-page booklet. And the interesting thing about the test is you can, apart from just doing an individual test, you can get 5 of your nearest and dearest to say what they think about your cultural intelligence as well. So you get a different baseline. So you get where your measurement came out, but then you also get what other people think of you, which could be at 2 very different spaces. But that obviously gives us a lot to work with as well.
So do you then go to organisations that need to have individuals tested, or is it something separate you offer? How does this work?
So there's a variety of different ways you can do this. It normally starts off as a consulting, often organisations that either are very proactive and they just want to be better at their values within their organisation and collaboration with different teams and different people. Or there's already a problem. Very often this is the case. So for example, someone's already about to sue an organisation for unfair dismissal, and they then realise that there's a problem and they need to work with that. So it normally starts off as a bit of a consulting piece, and we then do some internal workshops. And these could be around what is cultural intelligence and how do you use that within your organisation. It can be around different social values. So for example, one of the biggest conflict social values is a direct communicator versus an indirect communicator. And with that, for example...
What does that mean? Sorry.
Yeah, so for example, if this is probably not the best example, but one that everybody will be familiar with is when you get that question on, do I look good in this dress? I mean, that's a trick question from the beginning. You're pretty much set up to fail with whatever you answer there. But my girlfriends know that they can take me out and I will tell them exactly how they look in that dress. And those who are not open to hear that will probably ask somebody that's more of an indirect communicator. So somebody would say, well, you know, red is really your colour, but maybe not that tone of red. And half an hour later would actually then get to the point. And the point of social values, of course, is that there's no right and wrong answer or no point of the scale that's better than the other, but we are all so very different on those social values. So yes, that's an example of, and there's lots of examples in the workplace, of course, where people think they're doing the right thing because they're automatically a direct communicator and someone else experiences them to be extremely rude. Or the other way around is somebody takes a while to get to the point and the person who's normally a direct communicator thinks, man, this guy doesn't get to the point. What's wrong with him? Can they just, spit it out? And that leads to a lot of frustration in the workplace. So when people understand this better and they can realise, oh, that person is saying that because they communicate like this, you can reframe things, you can rephrase it, or you can change your own behaviour around that to get to the results quicker.
Now, I hate to say this, but we're in such a global market, which probably gets said way too much. This is something I imagine very important for business now.
Absolutely. We are globally getting closer and closer. 20, 30, 50 years ago, you had to fly somewhere to see somebody that was a little bit different from you. But in the moment in Perth or across Australia, 1 in 4 of us come from somewhere else. That's a pretty big statistic. So we have a lot of domestic diversity as well. I think very few people can claim that they now work in a workplace where they're all surrounded by Australians that's between a particular age and do eat particular cuisines and do particular things. We're all constantly exposed now to this global world. For example, we eat Italian food and we drive maybe a French car or whatever it is. But the majority of people still tend to hang out with people that are like them. And if you think of your closest circle of friends, most people tend to have people that have similar interests, similar beliefs, backgrounds. They even eat similar food. So they're not necessarily as exposed. And then they get thrown into a workplace where they have people that may be very different from them, and they have to figure out how to make it work.
Now, Tanya, I'm pretty good at being inappropriate. I sometimes I thrive at my inappropriateness. And sometimes it works for me, and sometimes it probably doesn't work for me, and people probably go, what is that guy on? So tell me, how important is it to have your cultural intelligence monitored or to understand it? Tell me about that.
The good news here is that cultural intelligence is not politically correctness. There is a difference here.
Okay.
And cultural intelligence is ultimately just a wider understanding of different perspectives and different cultures. As an expert in different cultures and human behaviour, not even as an expert can I know every little nuance of every single culture out there. And people who have something else as a main career certainly don't really even have an interest to know it all. But there are certain patterns that we can detect that it's the same across. So, for example, the social values with regards to indirect and direct communication. And once we become aware of what these patterns are, it becomes much easier then to read people better and to understand their perspectives better. And ultimately, we're all going to make mistakes along the line. We can't know every nuance of every culture, and sometimes we say something that could be highly appropriate. But if we're open enough as well to feedback on that and constantly asking and ready and open to apologise for that, I reckon we can easily fix it.
So what are some of the patterns I can look out for or notice?
Well, some of the things, for example, is to be aware of is anybody who knows a little bit about body language. I know one of your previous vlogs was a very interesting one with regards to body language. Body language is not the same across different cultures. Many of the current body language books out there is written only for Western cultures, but it's very different in many other Eastern cultures or certain European cultures. So first of all, maybe knowing that what you assume as reading is maybe just because of your in-group that you normally mix with. So for example, if we think about body language, I know one of the typical things is, people always talk about, well, the aggression with the folded arms, but there's so many other things that it could mean. And it's being open enough to not just jump to conclusions. I think that would be the best advice that one could give to anyone, is to not think you know it and rather ask more open-ended questions as well to really get to understand people better. I love the social values, for example, the direct and the indirect communication. But another one there that we often see in the workplace is individualism versus collectivism. Now, an individualist is somebody who's completely comfortable with making an autonomous decision. They'll walk into a room, shake your hand, sign the contract, get it done. Where collectivists would rather negotiate a little bit longer over the contract, first ask about your family, possibly sit together, and there's a process involved there. They're certainly not a let's just shake hands and sign the contract. But if you think your way is the only way and it's the right way, you may lose a lot of money on the table by approaching a negotiation with your way. So being open enough to all of these different approaches will certainly...
So how does that fall under a cultural thing, or is that just a personality thing? What's the difference? Is there a certain culture that would do one way than the other?
Absolutely, and that's a great question. So if you can imagine an iceberg where there's a little bit sticking out above the water, but there's much more underneath the water, that personality tip what we have at the bottom, we all have our individual little quirks and personality types. But cultures, that some of it's sitting above the water, but a big part of it's also sitting under the water. So for example, culture is ultimately the way we do things. But the way that you do things and the way that I do things could be slightly different.
Yeah.
So for example, if you talk about ethnic cultures, a particular country do things in a different way. So China versus Australia, for example, we have certain things that we do in a different way. A story that comes to mind here is there's a beautiful YouTube clip by a lady who talks about traveling from America to Japan. And she wants to order a cup of tea in Japan. Now, she orders a cup of green tea, but she asks for sugar with the tea. Now, in Japan, you don't really they're a saving face kind of nation. So they wanted to help her out here, and they didn't want her to embarrass herself by having green tea with sugar, because it's really not appropriate. You should really not drink green tea with sugar. But her individualist culture said, you know what? I'm an American, I know what I want, I know how I like it, it's my tea, I'm going to drink it, so surely I can have a cup of tea with sugar. So there she was, and she ordered a cup of tea with sugar. The waiter stood around awkwardly and went back to the kitchen to discuss this with the manager, and then came back, and there was a bit of a to and fro, but eventually, long story short, said he's very sorry, but they have no sugar. And this was after she insisted for a while that she really wanted with sugar, after he explained nicely that's not how one drinks green tea. And she was quite insistent that she'd like the sugar with it. To which he then said, well, sorry, ma'am, we don't have any sugar. She then changed her order to a coffee because she didn't want the tea without sugar. And what came resting on the side of the saucer? The sugar. And this is a typical example that you will see of an individualist versus a collectivist culture. And sometimes we can adjust how we do things just a little bit to compromise, to have better collaboration, to get along better in the workplace. I think we can make the world a much better place if we're all just that little bit more open to different perspectives.
Well, my wife knows I have a thing, because I wear my hat all the time, as you've probably noticed. And in our society, wearing a hat inside is not seen. You should take your hat off. Hence, more the reason why I wear the hat inside sometimes, because I have people that I know it plays on them. But it's not. I didn't start off with trying to be annoying. It's just because if I take my hat off, I'm going to leave it somewhere, and I'm going to leave and I'll forget it. So that's why I never take the hat off. Hence, it just stayed on. Now it feels normal to always have it on. But places I go to sometimes aren't hat friendly. So we have a saying: is it a hat friendly place? I should wear a hat or not wear a hat. So I won't take it with me if it's not a hat friendly place, because I'll lose it, because I'll put it down and I won't pick it up, and I'll go home without it. I go, I've left my hat again. Lost too many hats. So I have a thing where I'm actually going against my regular culture, my Western Perth culture, on a regular basis, because people don't like wearing hats inside. So do you have cases where people actually know their culture but are going against their culture and breaking it, and how that actually goes down then that way?
Absolutely. Especially because of the world that we live in, cultures kind of rub off. You know, when I moved to Australia, I had this honeymoon period in the beginning where I ate Tim Tams and I discovered Vegemite, and then I started missing all these things from back home again, and I was like, well, you know, where are those things? And then I got to a point where I went, you know what, I'm going to prefer Vegemite as opposed to Marmite, for example. But then I travelled back home, or where some of my family live in South Africa, and they kind of seem a little bit strange because I've taken on a new culture and my culture have changed. And there are many people that do exactly that. They take a little bit of the new culture on because they want to fit in. We all want to be part of the in-group.
Yeah.
And you then become part of the in-group by taking on some of the customs. You still keep some of your old customs and therefore really form a new culture. But the problem with that, of course, is that then when you go back to where you came from, or you mix with some of your old friends you haven't seen for a while, that somehow it doesn't quite gel anymore either.
You find out how far you've actually gone. You probably didn't think you'd gone that far, but you actually had gone a lot further than what you thought.
Exactly right. One other thing that comes to mind is a client of mine recently had a problem where they work in the disability services sector, and they realised that the people that came to look after some of the disabled people weren't doing the job as they would have liked them to do it. But these guys thought they were doing a great job. And they had a lot of African and Indian workers that thought as part of the service, they had to wipe all the bench tops clean and repack the groceries and put it all alphabetically, where the disabled person just wanted them to sit and chat there. But they thought, oh, you know what, if I do that, I'm going to waste the company's money and they pay me a salary, so I've got to do a good job. And it's changing that motto from not doing to others as they would like to be, rather doing to others as they'd like to be done to them as you would think they would like to do.
Oh, well, that's interesting. How do you go about changing that motto? I mean, that's such a fundamental I don't even know if it's a Western thing or if it's a worldwide thing where you'd like people to treat you like you want to be treated. So you're having to work out ways of flipping that.
Exactly right. I think it comes from a biblical background in many different ways. There's many different religions that embrace that you're a good person if you do unto others as you'd like to be done upon yourself. But the reality is, I mean, are you a coffee or a tea drinker, for example?
Yes, I drink tea.
Well, there you go. And if I'm a coffee drinker and I just bring you a coffee because I would have liked a coffee, you're not going to be as impressed. So if I rather figure that out, and this is at a bit of a superficial level, but if you go at a deeper cultural level, for example, if you have a secretary or somebody that you give certain tasks to do within your workplace, and you have a certain way in which you do it. Somebody that I work with, for example, is an extremely direct speaker, to the extent where I would sometimes start a conversation and she would go, oh yeah, I know what you're going to say. And then she'll go, so you want this and this and this, and then just complete the conversation before I've even started. And a lot of times this person gets it right. But not always. Now, if that person adapts their style just that tiny little bit to realize, hang on, they've got to tone their very directness back just a little bit, the person that they then give these instructional tasks to will probably perform much better as well, because they will get it in a way that's more friendly to them and therefore make them much more productive.
Anyone watching probably has pictured their own person like that. That'll finish a sentence, butt in early. I mean, I'm phenomenal for doing it, and I'm always trying to stop myself from sometimes. One person said, "Oh, Courtney just gets very excited, so he always wants to come in." You know, that was her nice way of saying I butt in too early. And bless her for saying it in that such a beautiful way. But it's something that I've noticed, and when I pick myself up on it, and that could be a cultural thing, especially like I do a lot of work going through different types of cultures, from Japanese, English, Irish, you name it. I work with a whole range of different people. And I could have been offending and not realising, and how much does that go on?
We all have a certain personality, hopefully around our careers as well, which makes us good at our careers. So for example, I do a lot of keynotes and public speaking, and I'm quite confident. But other people could see that as being just bossy and outright rude. So I need to know when I need to dial that confidence back as well. And I'm constantly practicing this as well, because I'm sure there's many others out there that can profess that they still get pretty irritated with me sometimes. Mm-hmm. But another group of people that I work a lot with is engineers. And engineers are obviously all unique individuals, but they do have a culture that holds them together. So for example, I'm married to a process engineer, which means there's a lot of systems and processes happening in his head at all times. I'm not exactly a systems and process kind of person. But what this looks like is we would go on a holiday, and I spoke at a conference in Michigan a while back, and we were taking a road trip down south to Texas, which is quite a long journey. And I was quite excited, and I said, it's great, we can land wherever we land, we see where we like to stay there for 2 nights, stay there for 3 nights. And he's like, no, we have to plan this. We have to see how many kilometers, where we're going to turn right, where we're going to go left. So we came to a compromise where I said, all right, you pick 3 places along the way, and we'll kind of meander our way to these places. But what this looked like in reality behind the scenes, a glimpse into my marriage, is that we would stop at a T-junction, and I would honestly not at that point know, am I going to turn right or left? And I would sit there pondering it for a while, and my husband would pipe up and he would go, not telling you where to go, but if you turn right, you will see 3 kilometers down the road, or miles in America, you will see this, and there's that place that got rated like this on Zomato, and you can stay over there. If you go left, you will see this. So he would spend the whole night, the previous night, doing research, because of part of who he is and how he thinks, he needs to be really organized. And this is a really great characteristic for somebody who works in a safety, occupational health and safety industry, like the mining engineer, for example, because you don't want that person to say, oh, well, you know, we'll drive the big vehicle into that pit and see what happens. You'd like someone that's going to be a little bit more measured, which is probably why I don't operate big, heavy vehicles. So we tend to match our job descriptions most of the time, but we also need to be really aware then of what that culture is around the people you hang out with, and how you need to compensate and how you need to read and understand other people as well. Another company that I used to work with is a maritime company. and maybe still technical expertise as in engineers, but they had a very different kind of problem. I had a phone call from the CEO at some stage saying, we have a problem and we want you to come in and fix it. And I go, great, that's what I do. What's the problem? And they said, well, it's a toilet problem. And I was like, obviously, I have many skills, but plumbing is not one of them. But it turned out that they had a group of people that were visiting from a company, and they had about 60 different people that had different behaviour in the toilets. Than they used the pits in the toilet as opposed to the seated white chairs that we have. And the bathrooms had lots of water on the floor as a result, and the local people were not too happy with this. So this was quite an interesting...
Are we saying water, inverted commas?
It was, it was water. It was water because
okay.
they used water in plastic bottles to clean themselves as opposed to paper, which is how we may prefer to do it. But this water then did sometimes make a mess on the floors as well. Clearly, some people were not too happy with the bathrooms, and they weren't sure if it was water either. But this was very easily resolved in the end by some cultural awareness training, which was obviously not called Toilet Training 101. And it was some wonderful people who came from a nation where it was really important to them to save face as well. But there was a flip side to this because it didn't take long to figure out that the local company also had a little bit of adjustment to do. So for example, some of their programs were scheduled on a Friday afternoon when these people really needed some religious time off to go and do their prayers. So they moved the classes around to accommodate them. They moved the menu around to accommodate them as well. And in the end, it was a win-win situation, which left them to sign these clients up for another couple of years, and a scenario which could have ended very differently as well have they not had that guidance.
So when they called you up and they briefed you on the problem, how did you then go about making a plan? What was your strategic way to then go, okay, this is what we need to do to solve this?
Well, I immediately knew when I knew who the people were they were talking about, what would some of the potential problems be, and suggested that we do some cross-cultural training, just a induction for them as they arrive. I did ask that nobody from the local company attends this because of the whole saving face nature of it as well, and that they could be more open in the workshop on a variety of different things. So we spoke about other things as well. For example, our policing system is a little bit different here in WA or in Australia in general than it is in many other countries, where you can maybe pay someone an extra Christmas bonus to make the ticket go away. So some of the training was also around, if you're going to drive vehicles, you can't drink, and if you're going to be pulled over by somebody, this is some of the behaviour that you need to be aware of that is appropriate and not appropriate, because we don't know what we don't know. And if you're in a particular culture and there was a particular way in which you used to do things for many years, you may be very surprised when you travel somewhere else that other people don't do it in that way.
Very true. The bribes. I never thought of it. So that was a nice way of, I guess, you had one problem and you thought, okay, there might be actually more problems. The iceberg scenario probably came. Here's the problem at the top of the iceberg above the water, but there might be more things that's actually going to start to come through. So there's an opportunity for that company then to sort of embrace a whole bunch of issues to go, well, let's tackle this, and this.
Absolutely. So some of the other outcomes for that organisation was then to come up with a diversity and inclusivity plan, and how can we do this better, and what does it look like, and what does our staff need to know about this to do this better.
Okay, so we've had engineering, we've had marine. Is there any other sort of industries that you find you get an interesting cultural mix going on?
Well, when you're a real estate agent in WA, you need something called CPD points, and that's just to maintain your licensing. So you get an hour of training, you get 1 point or half a point. And I recently got some courses registered, so I'm now a provider for the real estate industry where they can do 3 hours of emotional intelligence for real estate industry or 4 hours of cultural intelligence, which gives them 7 points ultimately. But a typical scenario, so I went and did a little bit of research because I'm not a real estate agent and don't necessarily know much of the inside workings of the real estate industry. And for me to present this well, I wanted to have a better understanding of it. So I went and interviewed a couple of people who were in the market hunting for houses to see what were some of the cultural problems that they came across. And it was really interesting to hear some of the stories. So for example, one of the ladies that I spoke to, her partner was from China, and the mother-in-law got involved, and she walked into the very first house and she went, well, this is not going to work, the feng shui is not correct. And the real estate agent had absolutely no idea what that meant or what to do with that, because, you know, move stuff around, or what does that look like? And another scenario was I spoke to a couple of real estate agents, and they go, oh, well, you know, we have a couple of people that come in and they just say, well, what's your lowest price that you can sell this house for? Which they obviously don't necessarily know, because that's not exactly how it works over here. But once you understand all of these different questions and where it comes from, you can also manage it better. Another thing that I think is really important to understand is unconscious bias. We all have unconscious bias, but it's how aware you are of those unconscious bias and how you actually end up managing them. Often, not only real estate agents, but certainly real estate agents as well, has formed a certain picture over time of showing many houses that, oh, if they walk in the door and they're Indian, this is how they're going to be, or if they walk in and they're Chinese, this is how they're going to be. Which sometimes could be right, because there is a particular culture around it, but what they don't understand is that there's all these exceptions, and what they sometimes then interpret as, now I have to change to do this, can land them into lots of hot water as well. Understanding, again, those different perceptions.
So sometimes you could be very well informed of different cultures from different nationalities, but you could use that against you? Is that what you're getting to?
Absolutely. The problem is you could use CQ as a bit of a weapon if you use it in the wrong way as well. It's a very powerful to grow your cultural intelligence, become more culturally aware, so that you can negotiate better and understand human behavior better and collaborate better. But of course, one could also use this for evil. One could also maybe decide to manipulate people as a result of knowing these things, which is obviously not what we promote. But yes, it could go the other way as well.
But in sales, I guess it gets very important between whether or not it's a business sale, like you're saying, real estate agents. I imagine, especially nowadays, you're going to get such diverse amount of type of people coming to see any property from. Everyone could be from a different country or a different background. But understanding how to actually approach each person can be quite crucial.
I think we tend to do things the same way. If you think of how you brushed your teeth this morning, I'm just going to make an assumption you did. You probably...
I hope I did for you.
You probably stood in the same spot, used the same hand, started in the same spot. And this is how we negotiate. This is how we make decisions every single day. It's called neuro-linguistic programming, where we have these patterns in our brain that is carved out in a certain way. I dare you to go tomorrow morning and stand on one leg and brush with your other hand and see how you go. You may find that a little bit difficult. And the same with negotiation. So you're sitting in front of somebody and you negotiate with the same pattern each and every single time because it's so comfortable for you and it's worked for you. As a result, you'll only get a certain part of the market.
Yeah.
If you can adjust that, however, and be a little bit more flexible and do it in different ways with different cultures, and by asking the right open questions at the beginning and understand where somebody comes from, I guarantee that you will sell better and your figures will go up.
Is this something that you teach companies, individuals, how to go about this process?
Absolutely. So part of what it is that we do to help you read people better, which if you implement that would ultimately lead to higher return on investment or bigger sales or better collaboration.
So from now, Tanya, you said you established RedHead Communications a couple of years ago in Perth, so you've only been going for 2 years. What's the future? Where to now? What's the plan of attack?
What's the plan of attack? That's a great question. How long is a piece of string? I'd love to make a change around the world, and it's such a big world out there. But keynotes, I love doing keynotes. You get to capture 1,000 people at the same time. So certainly doing some more keynotes out there, getting around, and not only in Perth, but breaking into the Asian market. Consulting, I really enjoy making a difference in organisations, and ultimately I think the world becomes a better place by people understanding unconscious bias, by people growing their cultural intelligence, and ultimately just having a slightly wider perception.
Okay, you mentioned Asian market. Now, RedHead Communications, this fiery South African RedHead Asian market, how does that mix go?
Oh, fantastic, because I already have those skills to be able to communicate. No, well, I've done a little bit of work in KL, and I really enjoyed the market over there. And I do some mentoring at UWA for the postgraduate students, and I've somehow every single time ended up with a student that came from Asia as well. And really enjoyed those relationships and building those relationships as well. We have a lot of organisations in Perth that do business in Asia. Mining companies, for example, do a lot of work in Japan, in China. And there's often a lot of conflict to be resolved, a lot of things that people just don't know. You don't automatically become culturally smarter by traveling and by being exposed to other cultures. Some people actually, I think, drop in their CQ. And an example of this was a recent manager that was performing extraordinarily well here in WA and ended up in China, and figures started dropping and things started going wrong, and it turned out that this individual just went every day from his home to his workplace and back, but still eating his Western food, having his Western habits, and probably have even enhanced those habits to hang on to his own culture, but as a result hasn't really blended into that culture as well. So there's definitely a lot of work to be done there, and in how that could look.
And Asia being such a close neighbour, such a great business opportunity for so many people here in Perth, this could be a real booming part of your business.
I've gotten involved recently with the Singapore Exchange program, a guy called Roy who started up this amazing initiative where he is doing business between Singapore and Perth. And there's a lot of great investors in Singapore with a fair bit of money that they would like to bring this way, and they're looking for opportunities. But an understanding how the WA market is different, they may need a little bit of work over there as well. And another industry is, of course, the hotel industry.
Yeah.
We often end up over there as Aussies, and they have clients from all around the world. It's a hot destination from Europe as well. And there's no more diverse workplace than the hospitality industry with people from all walks of life. To me, the great thing about living in this global world is you can go wherever you travel to, take the bits and pieces that you like and bring it back and make it your own. So I've taken bits and pieces, I think, from everywhere. I know when I originally came to Perth, I could, for the life of me, not understand why people constantly said, "See you later." I mean, what is it with "see you later"? You're not going to see me again. What is that about? And it became very clear to me that that's just a greeting. It's just how we do things around there. And there's the Australian culture for you in that one sentence. See you later, mate.
Now, before we say goodbye to Tanya, what is it? Give the viewers maybe 1, 2, 3, maybe top three tips or pointers that we could do to be more culturally aware.
I think the first and the most important one is to just sit back and observe. We tend to jump into things so quickly sometimes. By sitting back and just looking at why people do things and what is it that they're doing, we could learn so much. And once you've learned a little bit more, my second step would be to start mirroring that behaviour. And what I mean with that is to build that rapport and to get on better with people. For example, just by slowing down the way I know that I speak really fast, and I have to remind myself to speak slower. But if you speak to somebody from a different culture that is much more even toned and they speak much slower, when you match that, they will like you better, because people like people that are like them. So try and mirror other people's behaviour as well. So speak a little bit slower, or if typical Italian that likes speaking with their hands. If you're a much more reserved speaker, when you speak to somebody who does speak like that, by just changing how you speak a little bit. And my last tip would really be to just be open. Be open to other ideas before you jump in and judge and say, well, that's obviously not the right way. Is it maybe just a different way of getting to the same result?
There you go, different ways. I think that's a key and fundamental point that we all should take with us. So until next time, and hopefully get Tanya back here soon to give us some more points on cultural awareness. Bye for now.
Thanks, Courtney.